See, I realized something about myself that was really difficult for me to admit. I realized that I don't depend on God as nearly as much as I thought that I did. See, I've gotten really good at moving according to my own abilities, my own experience, my only problem solving skills. And then after everything works out, I thank God for blessing something that I never actually invited Him to be a part of. So this week, I'm not talking about y'all. This week, I'm talking about me. But if the shoe fits, go ahead and wear it. Today I want to lean in on something a little different. The difference between living by faith and living by competence. Because see, these two things are not always the same. See, competence can accomplish a lot without requiring dependence. See, the longer we walk with God, the easier it is to mistake our experience for maturity, for dependence, and our ability to trust. See, we get really good at problem solving and making decisions and navigating difficult seasons and even overcoming obstacles. But before we know it, we're not moving in God, we're moving with confidence because we've become confident in our own selves. And see, sometimes God allows the fire to be turned up, not to destroy us, but to actually reveal to us what we've been relying on. Because see, pressure has a way of exposing what comfort hides. It reveals whether our confidence is in God's voice or in our own capability. And that's exactly what we see when we open up Genesis 16. See, before we jump into Genesis 16, let's remember how we got there. See, back in Genesis 12, God revealed to Abraham to leave his familiar country, his family, his father's household, and go to a land that God was going to show him, right? And it was no map, it was no destination, it was just a promise. And Abram, which is what he was called at that time, took a leap of faith. And then we got to Genesis 15, and then God reaffirmed his promise to Abram. And he said, look up at the stars, and if you can count them, that's how numerous your descendants are going to be. See, the only problem was this. Abram and Sarai still had no children. Years had passed. The promise was still alive, but nothing around them suggested that they were getting closer to that promise. So by the time we arrived at Genesis 16, we're not looking at a man who doesn't know God. See, we're looking at a man who has actually walked with God. See, a man who has obeyed God. A man who has seen God make promises. But he's also a man who's gotten tired of waiting. And isn't that where many of us find ourselves? I'm talking about me. That's where I find myself, see. See, we don't abandon God overnight. We just get weary of waiting. We start wondering if maybe God is expecting us to do something He never asked us to do. We begin confusing initiative with obedience, activity with faith, and capability with dependence. See, that's the tension of Genesis 16. See, God had already spoken. The promise had already been made. But the process became longer than Abraham expected. So when Abraham was suggested by Sarah to do something, Abraham agreed. Not because Abraham stopped believing God, but because he stopped trusting God's timing. And God's method, well, that wasn't enough for him. So this is what stuck with me this week. See, sometimes the greatest threat to God's promise isn't unbelief. It's believing God needs us to help him. And that's where Abraham was. And if I'm honest, that's where I've been too. See, God had already made Abraham a promise. He told him he would be a father of many nations. God wasn't vague. God wasn't uncertain. The promise had already been spoken. The only problem was time, because years had passed and there still was no child. There was no visible progress and no explanation, just silence. And isn't that like the worst thing? Isn't that where many of us struggle? Not because God hasn't spoken, but God hasn't moved according to our schedule. So this is what Sarah does. Sarah comes to Abraham with another plan. And she says, if God hasn't done it yet, maybe we need to help him. My version. So she offers Hagar. And Abraham, well, he agrees. But what fascinates me about this story isn't just what Abraham did. It's what the text doesn't say. It never says Abraham stopped to seek the Lord. He didn't ask God, is this your direction? He didn't pray, Lord, is this how you intend to fulfill your promise? He simply moved because the opportunity made sense. See, the issue wasn't that Abraham stopped believing God's promise. The issue was that he stopped depending on God's process. And that's where this message became personal for me. See, I realized that I've been in seasons where I believed God, but I wasn't actually following God, if that makes sense. See, I was following my experience. I was following my instincts. I was following what I knew how to do. And see, there's a difference between me believing God exists and me depending on God to lead me in my next step. See, many of us don't move because God spoke. We move because we can or we can't. See, I've learned how to build businesses. I've learned how to manage money. I'm a good leader and communicator. And well, I definitely have mastered the art of fixing problems. See, these abilities are gifts from God. But our gifts can become dangerous when we quietly replace them with the giver. See, sometimes we become so competent that prayer becomes optional. See, we stop asking because we've become accustomed to figuring it out ourselves. See, we don't intentionally leave God out, but we do. We just don't invite him in. And then when everything works out, we go and we thank God for blessing us for something that we never asked him to direct. See, but pressure exposes what comfort conceals. See, as long as life stays manageable, I was walking by faith. But when the fire got hotter over the last few weeks, when I couldn't solve the issue myself, when I couldn't control the timeline, when my credit score or my financial situation wasn't enough. See, then I discovered where my confidence was really resting. See, was my peace in God, or was my peace in my ability to manage life? See, it's easy to say we trust God when we still have a backup plan. It's much harder when every backup plan disappears. See, sometimes God lets the fire rise, not because he's abandoned us, but because he's revealing us to ourselves. He's not looking to shame us. He's not looking to embarrass us, but to lovingly show us where dependence has quietly been replaced with self-sufficiency. See, here's what I've learned. I've learned that faith doesn't move because something makes sense. Faith moves because God spoke. See, Abraham acted because circumstances presented a reasonable solution. But God never gave that instruction. And that raises a challenging question. See, how many things have I asked God to bless that I never asked him to build? Relationships, business ideas, career moves, financial decisions, ministry opportunities. See, I moved first. Then I invited God afterwards. See, it's almost like me saying, Lord, since I'm already here, can you bless this? Come bless this for me, Lord. Instead, I should have been saying, Lord, is this where you want me to be in the first place? See, I've also learned something else. I've learned that God is less interested in being my emergency contact. He's more interested in being my daily guide. See, too often we become so dependent only when we're desperate. But dependence isn't supposed to begin in a crisis. See, our dependence should be defined by our relationship. And this is where another truth hit me. See, when you're focused, when you're locked in, you can't be distracted. So when your faith is locked in on God, every shiny opportunity doesn't pull you away. Every delay doesn't make you panic. Every closed door doesn't make you question yourself. See, when your eyes are fixed on God, you don't manufacture an Ishmael because Isaac is taking too long. See, you don't confuse delay with denial. And you don't rush ahead simply because waiting has become uncomfortable. See, because if your attention is on the clock, it's not on Christ. See, distraction happens when our focus shifts from God's voice to our current circumstances. And then fear starts looking for alternative. Faith starts looking at God and not alternative. So maybe God isn't asking you to do more. Maybe he's just asking you to depend more. Maybe he's not trying to increase your ability or my ability, but maybe he's trying to decrease our self-sufficiency. Because you see, the greatest miracle isn't that God blesses what we build. The greatest miracle is having enough trust to refuse building anything until God is a part of it. So before you make your next decision, before you send that next email, before you sign that next contract, before you say yes to that opportunity, or before you move because it makes sense, just pause for a second and ask the simple question. God, are you in this? Or am I simply capable of doing it? Because there's a big difference between God blessing your effort and God directing your steps. See, we may have become people whose confidence is not found in our competence, but we want to become people that have complete dependence on the one that never failed. See, maybe you don't need to be reminded of your competence versus your dependence, but maybe you know someone that does. So this is what I want you to do. If this is you, I want you to share this with them. And if you got something out of this, because this is just me talking about me. If you got something out of this, then I want you to like it. And until next week, I want you to stay locked in on your faith and focus on God and not your timeline, but Him ordering your steps. Invite Him into the process and not just ask Him to bless the aftermath. And I'll see you next week. Stay blessed.